The Civil War ends, the Reconstruction era begins. This is where they had to merge a previously slave population and a previously rebellious population into one. And honestly, I think they could have done it if Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated in 1865, well, he wasn't assassinated. He wanted the post-war to be revolved around managing reunion and reconciliation. And his vice president who took over, Andrew Johnson, thought that the South never had the right to succeed in the first place. And since he himself was a Southerner, he didn't like the people who snubbed him. He was also a racist and didn't think blacks needed a place in the Reconstitution. Yeah. Presidential Reconstruction started in 1865 and it lasted until 1867. Andrew Johnson had provisional governors and ordered them to hold state conventions where they were supposed to establish these new governments, but these new governments were 100% white and they oppressed former slaves, so they looked a lot like the old Confederate government they were trying to replace. Black codes were even enacted in 1865, and basically they're legal codes that replaced the word slave with Negroes and gave them rules and barely any rights and hardly any freedom of their own. Black codes show how unwilling white governments were to give rights to African Americans. For former slaves, a lot was changing. The Freedmen's Bureau, that only lasted until 1870, was powerful enough to help former slaves start developing universities like Frisk and Howard, also primary and secondary schools as well. They were also able to divide up Confederate land that was owned by former slave owners for former slaves, and the land was very important because back then land was the key to freedom, and many of the former slaves felt like the Union Army owed them land. Personally, I think it's shit how General Sherman's Field Order 15 promised to give out land in 40-acre plots, and Andrew Johnson didn't let that happen. He took away all the land, gave it back to its previous racist owners, and now they have the South that's still largely agricultural, being owned by the same people who had the land before. The only difference is there's sharecropping. Sharecropping is basically where landowners provided housing, tools, not that house, more like this. Anyways, the sharecroppers received a share. They received a third or a half of their crops. Freed blacks controlled their work, and plantation owners got a steady workforce who they knew couldn't leave even if they wanted to. It wasn't easy for them to make money or save money or to invest in stuff like land and tools, and that stuff's important to start a free man's life. By the late 1800s, a lot of the sharecroppers were white, and by the Great Depression, most of them were fully white, and it wasn't considered slavery, but it did tie workers to a land that they did not own, and that's the opposite of what Thomas Jefferson wanted, which was small independent farmers. When the Republicans in Congress saw what the so-called Reconstruction South looked like, they weren't happy. They took over the Reconstruction age in 1867. Radical Republicans felt the war was fought for equal rights, and it was. They didn't exactly take away land from the southern farmers and give it to the freed slaves, but they did pass the Civil Rights Bill that in 1866 made everyone born in the United States citizens and equal regardless of race. Johnson vetoed it, not surprised, but he also said trying to protect the rights of African Americans was discrimination to white people. Yeah, I know, it made Congress mad too, so they did something they had never done before in American history, and they overrode the president's veto with a 2/3 vote. The law passed, and then so they made the 14th Amendment, which states that citizenship guarantees equal protections and the Bill of Rights extends to all states. The amendments had no Democratic support, but didn't really need any since there was no Democrats in Congress, since Congress didn't see Johnson's races as representatives, and that's a good thing since now we have one of the most important amendments. Again, in 1867, over Johnson's veto, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act. The Reconstruction Act divided the South into 5 military districts and required each state to make new governments that included black men. And the new government had to ratify the 14th Amendment to be welcomed back into the Union. Thus, radical Reconstruction had begun. In 1868, Andrew Johnson ran for president. He lost to Republican and former Union General Ulysses S. Grant. His margin of victory was so small, Republicans said that more or less we would win more if African Americans could vote. So Congregational Republicans pushed the 15th Amendment, which made states let men vote, regardless of race. However, because of gender, literacy, or whether your grandfather could vote or not, the states had a lot of wiggle room to deny African Americans that right, in which they did. Now we have the federal government saying who can and can't vote, who isn't a citizen. They're making equality under the law, and this is a big deal because the national government became the custodian of freedom, as radical Republican Charles Sumner stated, rather than a threat to individual liberty. Now, former slaves have the legal protection and start using their rights. They held sit-ins in traffic to block streetcars, they voted in elections, and they held office. Most of the Africans were Republican, and since they were a large part of the population, the Republican Party dominated politics in the South. There was about 2,000 African Americans who held office, and unlike what lots of racist sites say, many were not corrupt. Having African Americans office holders was a huge deal in ensuring rights to African Americans because it meant that there was black juries and less discrimination in state and local governments, even if it was just providing basic services. But in the end, Republican governments failed in the South. There was some achievements like a school system where they did educate both black and white children. They were segregated though. And they created a functioning government where both black and whites could participate, and it was even stated by a South Carolina lawyer, and I quote, "We have gone through one of the most remarkable changes in our relations to each other that has been known perhaps in the history of the world." Obviously, that's a big overstatement, since although they knew each other better, it wasn't a secret who suffered and who didn't, and who was barely considered equal to. There was a lot of corruption, and it was in the North also. I mean, they are governments, but that's not why Reconstruction ended. It ended because of stuff like road repair and schools. They cost money, which means taxes, which made the Republican government unpopular. The second, white Southerners could not accept African Americans exercising basic civil rights, holding office, or voting. Since they wanted to return to the way they were before Reconstruction, most people looked to violence, especially after 1867. Much of the violence towards African Americans in the South was politically motivated. The KKK was founded in 1866 on some real hateful shit, and it quickly became a terrorist organization targeting Republicans, black or whites, and they'd kill or beat them up to keep them from voting. They did the massacre at Colfax, Louisiana, where hundreds of former slaves were murdered. So with all these discriminatory voting laws and all these threats, fewer black men voted, which allowed white Democrats to take control of the state's governments in the South by people called redeemers, because they claimed to have redeemed the South from the Northern Republic, corruption, and black rule. I wouldn't have been surprised if the South would have fallen back into Democratic hands like over time, but it came way faster, and it was aided by Northern Republicans losing interest in Reconstruction. In 1873, the U.S. fell into another not quite great economic depression, and Northerns basically didn't want to fight for the right of black people in the South anymore because it was hard and it was expensive. By 1873, the supporters of the Reconstruction era had dipped, and the Democrats were resurgent, especially in the South, now with the election coming up. The Democrats nominated Samuel Tilden, and the Republicans chose Ruther B. Hayes. But in 1876, there was a disputed electoral votes in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. When this happens, Congress is supposed to decide the winner. In this case, they couldn't. They appointed a 15-man electoral commission, or a super committee, if you will. There was 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. So with Hayes as president, he agreed to give up control of the South to the Democrats and stop meddling in Southern affairs, and to build a transcontinental railroad through Texas, the bargain of 77. And it killed the Reconstruction era. With no federal troops in the southern states and no control of the southern legislations, the states went back to doing their own thing, their own racist thing, like resisting the freedom of black people. They passed the Jim Crow Acts that limited African Americans' access to public accommodation. They took black people's right to vote, and the social and economic mobility in African Americans in the South declined. The Reconstruction amendments and laws that were passed gave former slaves political freedom and rights. That's basically the end of the Reconstruction era. I'm sorry that I don't know how to give presentations, but thank you if you watched.